Hello, my name is Brian of Hastings County, and I'm glad that you could join us again today for another TTRPG Talk. This series discusses tabletop role-playing games and related materials, suggests ideas for your own game, and looks at some of my own materials as well. Today, we're going to be doing something a little bit different, because this is going to be a primer of sorts for an SRD mini-series that I will be shortly adding to. But first, of course, before we can really start discussing those SRDs, we need to answer the question in the title. What is an SRD? Well, SRD stands for System Reference Document. Normally, an SRD includes all of the core rules that a game system really needs to function. This is so that a person could hack the system to create new games for it by adding new mechanics or settings, or even adding to the existing canon and materials that are available for a pre-existing game, like, let's say, Morkboard, right, or Dungeons & Dragons. Speaking of which, an example of an SRD would be the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition SRD. This includes the absolute basic rules that you would need if you wanted to adapt that system or create extra materials for existing 5e games. So this SRD would basically include the different sorts of language that you would need, explaining ability scores, skill checks, how races and classes work, and so on. While you could, in theory, play D&D using just the SRD, that's not its original intent, and you definitely would not get the full effect of the game. With just a little hunting, you'll actually find that most of the popular tabletop role-playing games out there actually have an SRD of some kind or another kicking around, even if it might not be for the most recent version of the game. SRDs can also include other resources that are very useful for creators. One of the most common additions is the legal language for licensing that you are allowed to use the SRD's mechanics under. Please, 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 please be sure to read these parts of the documents very carefully if you're contemplating the creation of a game using this system. I cannot stress this enough. Some licenses are pretty standard, like the Creative Commons license, that simply require you to just include some attributions, disclaimers, or do other similar small actions. However, others can be much more restrictive in their terms of use. Sometimes this is to allow the creator of the SRD to curate the use of their creative works, which is somewhat understandable. For example, the Creative Comrades license has a clause in it that prohibits the use of licensed materials to create NFTs or to use blockchain-enabled platforms. It also prohibits the use of using that particular license for entities that have earned more than $1 million at some point in the last 3 years. Presumably so that people who are actually making lots of money could negotiate some other sort of paid license as opposed to a free license. A number of other SRDs will also include clauses in their licensing that prohibit the use of creating materials with them that are bigoted or intentionally harmful towards marginalized peoples, as well as prohibiting harmful ideologies, as well as promoting harmful ideologies using the materials in the game, like, ethnic or race-based supremacy movements, like white nationalism, of course, or another obvious example would be, fighting against fascism, right? Obviously, these licenses do not necessarily completely eliminate having these elements present in your game. They just rather encourage you that if you are going to be including them in your game, that either A, it's some sort of world building setting where the characters are fighting against that, or it's showing the evils of those basic behaviors and political ideologies, or it's some sort of parody of that's not promoting, but rather instead is, again, kind of fighting against and making fun of it and stuff like that. Other licenses have further restrictions on the kinds of materials that you can create using these things, or how and where you can release your games to the public. Again, I mentioned the license that prohibits the use of it, creating NFTs out of materials from using the resource, but other ones are issued by larger publishing companies in order to try to protect their intellectual assets. For example, they might require that you only release things for free, that you only publish to certain websites, that you basically give up certain rights when it comes to distribution and publishing in order to be allowed to use the SRD. Another thing that a number of SRDs will include is advice for creators. For example, the Lumen SRD includes information behind the creator, Spencer Campbell's intent, for a number of the mechanics contained within, and also provides examples on way that you could utilize some of those mechanics differently than ways that he has done so far when creating games using the system. Another example of this would be the Carta SRD, which includes ideas for card prompts that you could potentially also utilize. Finally, an SRD will also normally include resources that encourage an appearance of uniformity among games made using the SRD, like logos, fonts, page backgrounds, and other assets. This is not just to promote the SRD, but it also encourages people familiar with the game system that you've used to potentially try out your game. For example, placing the Harmony Drive logo on my own game, Sagu Roleplaying Joseon, means that someone who is already familiar with the system, like thanks to playing Cat McDonald's Heroic Horde, is likely going to be more willing to pick up my game because they already have a basic idea of how it works. As an indie creator, we need to remember that familiarity can sometimes be a critical factor in a player picking up our own game or encouraging others to play our games as well, particularly if that player is not already familiar with our personal work as a creator. This is in part because it does encourage a level of trust between the creator and the customer, essentially. This familiarity also allows the person who is playing the game to realize that they don't necessarily have to learn all this from scratch, because although if you're a creator of a game, that means you're probably already pretty comfortable with learning new rules and things like that, a lot of people who play games aren't, right? Or at the very least, they're not going to want to try something new at the drop of a hat. So creating basically an air of comfort and familiarity is really helpful for those people to realize that learning your game is not going to be quite so hard than, let's say, learning something that uses a completely new rule system that they're not familiar with. One more thing I wanted to kind of add in our discussion of what an SRD is would be why you would want to potentially use one. Obviously, whenever you're really thinking about potentially creating a game, you really have one of two choices. You can either A, utilize an SRD or base it off of a game that someone else has already created, or B, basically starting out from scratch. Now, starting out from scratch does have certain appeals. One, you can pretty easily create a system that is tailor-made for the type of storytelling you want to have your game be able to do, or perfectly match in with the setting or whatnot. However, there are obviously some major downsides to basically making your own game from scratch. Number one, that means that you're going to have to be doing a whole lot more playtesting to see if this is even going to work. If you are using an SRD, that means somebody has already created this SRD. They've probably already used it to make multiple games themselves, or other people have used it to make multiple games. At least the core elements of it are pretty well tested, right? You don't need to worry about ridiculous imbalances and things potentially throwing off, or just it being such a slog that it's not fun, right? A second issue that doing it on your own has that you would not necessarily need to worry about with an SRD is that you're not on your own if you're using an SRD. There's, out there for a number of the different sort of game systems, there are communities out there that have been making games based on these rule sets, these SRDs for quite a while. Unless it's a brand new one, like for example, the Lumen system is the classic one that I always is the classic one that I always refer to, just because that has a very tight knit, strong community that's really willing to reach out and help people who are potentially thinking about making a Lumen game. Right. Another thing that I would argue that makes SRDs potentially really useful for a creator is that it saves you time. Again, like I said, if you're making a system from scratch, you're having to do lots of testing, you're having to do lots of trying to figure out the brainstorming and trying to figure out the basic concepts of how you're going to potentially do this thing, that if you're utilizing an SRD, it saves you a lot of brain time and energy that instead you can then spend on building out your setting, adding extra mechanics, or finding ways to tweak the mechanics to make them fit your setting, the type of storytelling, the type of game that you're trying to make, rather than having to build it all from the ground up. Another advantage for using an SRD is that people are already going to be, as I mentioned previously, people are already going to be familiar with the basics of how your system works, right? If I pull up a Lumen game, I'm going to know what the basics of the dice system is going to be pretty much no matter what, unless that was one of the things that you tweaked. And if it is, it's probably not going to be that hard to figure out how it was changed and why. Okay, now here's the best example. Why are there so many variations on 5e games? Because some people are familiar with 5e games and they like that role system because they find that it is familiar and it is useful for them. And so they keep playing games based off of it. Right. Finally, the last thing I just want to bring up is that in reality, there are only so many different ways to reinvent the wheel. And chances are that if you are creating something from scratch, it'll probably be pretty good. But there's also probably a pretty good chance that there's already a system out there that does what you want to do, or at least is close to what you want to do, and would be pretty easy to kind of tweak and potentially make your own SRD out of. Some of you might have read blog posts that I have made before, or potentially have taken a look at the Tutelary Society. Sorry, my tongue didn't want to make that word. Tutelary is sometimes hard for me to say. The Tutelary Society has the Blossom system in it. Blossom being basically a 5-lobed sort of like Venn diagram system where you have a base set of different background things that have happened or elements that might exist for a magic system or something, and then they combine together to actually create the spells that you have or the skills that you have. You're relying on backstory building for your character, and that is what defines what your character is good at or not good at. Where did that come from? That came from me seeing Venn 6, which is another SRD that literally utilizes a 4-lobed Venn diagram to build the backstory of your character to then inform what your character is good at doing today. Now, granted, the way I use Blossom is a bit different, and the way I used Blossom kind of also helped build out sort of stretching it beyond what the original creator of Venn 6 had in mind, which is fine, which is why I feel relatively comfortable, once I get around to actually writing it, potentially calling the Blossom system an actual new SRD, a child SRD, let's say, to Venn 6, right? Because of other things I'm going to add to it, right? So feel free to, if nothing else, it'll give you, looking at SRDs, whenever you're creating a game, even if you decide to go your own route and just make something from scratch, it is going to help inform your ideas of what would be good mechanics to combine together. What sorts of dice systems do you want to use, or card systems in the case of things like Carta, or maybe even diceless systems like in the case of No Dice, No Masters, right? It'll inform your basic idea of what are things that people have done before. What are things that will help me create something that is new and different and exciting and informative? And that's the basics of what an SRD is. If you have any further questions, please feel free to include them in the comments below. If you have an SRD of your own that you would like for me to potentially feature in my SRD series, then please either comment it below or send me a message via Twitter, which you can find in the bio link posted again in the description of this video. Any links to other items that I referenced in this video, such as some of the SRDs, the Creative Comrades license, or some other materials, again, can be found in the description. Now, go out there and create worlds of your own. And remember to rate your itch purchases and SRDs. If you'd like to see more material on this topic, please feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel or check out the blog at hessenscounty.com.